everyone. I'm Amy, obviously. This is James. And we just want to say first that we're incredibly honored to be here and excited about the conversation tonight. Not only are we in the birthplace of the sanctuary movement, but in the legacy of all of this important work that we just heard about. And we're here to learn as much as we are to talk about the book that we wrote and the research that we've done and our experience as organizers. The book that we wrote is called Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels and Black Power, Community Organizing in Radical Times. And those radical times that we're talking about are the 1960s and 70s, but arguably radical times can take many different forms. And there's a long radical and progressive tradition in North America that we draw on in writing this book, and that we consider ourselves part of that tradition as activists and organizers today. We came to this book as activists and organizers looking to understand a hidden piece of history, allies in the struggle with the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, allies to the American Indian movement, the Young Lords and Puerto Rican nationalists, the Young Patriots, a group called Join Community Union, Rising Up Angry, October 4th organization in Philadelphia, and a group called White Lightning. So there's 5 organizations we write about. But I want to start tonight by telling you about one of the women that we write about in the book, a woman who arguably really was a mother of the movement for some of these organizations in a way. Her name is Peggy Terry. And in 1955, Peggy Terry was living in Montgomery, Alabama. It was one of many stops in her migration as a poor southern white woman, born in Oklahoma, back and forth to Kentucky. She lived in Texas. She picked citrus fruit. She picked cotton. She lived on the road for many years, and in 1955 found herself in Montgomery, Alabama. So for anyone who's a student of history and the Civil Rights movement, Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 was the site of the birth of the bus boycott. And Peggy Terry and a bunch of her girlfriends went down to the Montgomery jail to check out the spectacle. She didn't go down to the jail as an ally to the Civil Rights movement at that point. They went down to see something they'd never seen before. Black folks standing up for their civil rights, organizing for integrated buses, for a desegregation of the buses, for a seat on the front or anywhere else they chose to sit on the bus. But what happened to Peggy when she was there was that she saw Martin Luther King and other men released from prison or released from the jail and beaten by a gang of whites, a mob of whites. And their nonviolence, in contrast to the mob's brutality, shocked her and started her on a process of asking questions about where she stood on these issues. Her grandfather and her father had been supporters of the Klan, and like many white folks in the South, but particularly poor white folks, even living next door to the Black community or working side by side with other migrant workers from Mexico, she had never questioned what she had grown up with. She had never really called herself to task on where she stood on them. You just simply didn't talk to people who weren't like you. Her journey began that day. And it took her many years before her transformation turned her into not just an ally to the civil rights struggle and someone who interacted with Dr. King, but a leader in that movement, and in particularly a leader who was organizing her own people. Poor whites, poor white Southerners, many of them had migrated to the North for economic reasons, women on welfare, and men and women who had little education like herself, but who had a lifetime of experience being kicked around by bosses and politicians, being kicked out of their homes, struggling for daycare, struggling for community centers, harassed by the police and drafted into wars. She was working with poor and white working class communities, but she didn't get there easily. She didn't want initially to work with poor whites. She was ashamed of where she'd come from, and she also was very comfortable working in the civil rights movement as an ally, and didn't possibly see what good can come from organizing other poor whites, who she, based on her growing up experience, and many of the things she witnessed in the news, the reaction to civil rights, she felt legitimately and in the challenge that racism is a very ugly thing and a difficult thing to unlearn, and there was so much work to do. How could it possibly be done with poor and working class whites, the people that she'd grown up with, the people that she lived side by side? But at the time, civil rights leaders, Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, and increasingly the Black Power movement as that came to arise in the mid to late 60s, were asking white activists to organize and reach out to their own communities, to organize and reach out to white folks on campuses, in working class neighborhoods, back down in the South, and wherever they lived. And Peggy Terry was one of many dozens of organizers who actually tried to listen to that call. Peggy Terry got together with an organization that was founded by Students for a Democratic Society, one of the largest student organizations in US history, definitely one of the largest organizations during the 60s, a project called Join Community Union in Chicago. They worked on housing campaigns and organized rent strikes. They fought for playgrounds and daycare centers. They worked to stop the exploitation of day laborers in a poor white neighborhood while building alliances across Chicago with communities of color and civil rights group, and then increasingly Black Power organizations. That work led to the formation of the Young Patriots, an organization of white youth that was arguably a little bit more radical and in your face than Joint Community Union. Peggy's son was one of the founders of that organization. They ended up in an alliance called the Rainbow Coalition with the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. Another organization grew out of that work called Rising Up Angry. And as I mentioned before, two other organizations, October 4th and White Lightning, also collaborated with these groups. And together they represent a kind of family tree, a tendency of white activists who were committed to taking the call to organize your own very seriously, figuring out what that looked like, sometimes in neighborhoods that were changing and weren't white anymore. Neighborhoods like Uptown, where Peggy lived, were majority white, but rapidly changing through the course of the decade. So they grappled with these questions around how do you reach poor and working class white folks? That transformation, like it took for Peggy, was not an overnight transformation for many of the people in the neighborhoods that these groups work with. But for others, there was a long progressive tradition. There was a readiness and a willingness to be in alliance and to really work on the issues that affected poor people overall. So one of the things James is going to touch on a little bit more about some of these groups specifically, and that we want to talk about tonight, is what are some of the lessons. Some of those lessons have already been touched on tonight. That organizing takes a long-term approach, that the work that we do is one person at a time, one campaign at a time, one fight at a time, with a long-term approach to building alliances and organizing. And that in particular, what we learned from some of their work with poor whites is that poor people have a unique relationship to power in society, and that for poor whites have a particularly unique relationship to power in society as both disenfranchised persons and also as people who are protected under the guise of the benefits of white supremacy. That those can be very real and material or psychological benefits, but that you don't organize a community by knocking on their door and saying, hey, bad things are happening to other people, you know you have a ton of power and privilege, do you want to join? That sometimes there are these moments, like Peggy's moment at the jail, where something clear was going on that was wrong, that you can bring people into the struggle with a clear disparity like that. And other times you need to engage people around the things that are also impacting them, around the common alliances, the common issues, the housing, the prisons, the police, and that people understand those issues, and from there with a clear and explicit focus on anti-racism and anti-poverty at the heart of your organization. And for these groups, it also meant anti-sexism over time. They really valued women's work as well. That the transformations that people went through often weren't overnight and often came from being engaged around issues that they could relate to.
So our book came out right about the same time that the Occupy movement started to take off. So we like to joke that it was just all a plan from our publisher. They were working behind the scenes, had the greatest publicity stunt ever to sell books. Not really. But I think I feel equally momentous coming to Tucson as the battle that we've known that has been coming for a long time around ethnic studies has been kicking off. Ethnic studies and the larger field of history from below, we asked, why is this such a threat? And it is a threat. I heard somebody say, well, why are they afraid of books? Books aren't a threat. Well, actually, books are a threat. And ethnic studies is a threat because it's part of the process of rehumanization. For the sons and daughters of the originally colonized, it's a part of the process of rehumanization, of regaining a sense of collective worth, of self-worth, of the right of knowing that rebellion is righteous. For the sons and daughters of the colonizers, it's a chance to understand the world through a new set of eyes and to plot a new future for your people, and a new future hopefully in tandem with each other, so we can actually finally break this horrible thing of white supremacy, of class oppression, of conquest, and get rid of it once and for all. And another form of rehumanization is community organizing, and another form of rehumanization is alliance building, which was the original Rainbow Coalition that Amy referred to. The original Rainbow Coalition, very much based in Malcolm X's teaching of everybody organize their own, but come together in coalition. A strategy that was developed by the Black Panther Party for self-defense, especially the Chicago branch. It was a form of rehumanization, of raising voices against oppression, but also breaking down some of the oldest barriers and the oldest limitations of community organizing as it was understood, bridging self-interest to solidarity, right? It wasn't enough to raise your voice around your own housing conditions. You had to target the landlord who had property in both black, brown, and poor white communities, and that was a process of rehumanization, of ironically building the type of beloved community that Martin Luther King had predicted. And one of the things that I think about when we think about Martin Luther King and the idea of the beloved community is such a stark contrast to what we hear about the race-blind world that we're supposed to be in, the world that the country that is now beyond race because we have a black president, right? Martin Luther King's vision was a vision of the beloved community based in reckoning, based in dismantling white supremacy, based in an anti-poverty approach, and it's starkly different and very radical. Just like the Black Panther Bob Lee said that the Rainbow Coalition was just a code word for class struggle, I believe that the beloved community was just a code word for a very different, very beautiful form of socialism that had not actually existed on this earth and does not exist yet. One of the so within a Rainbow Coalition, what is the role of working class white organizations? So one organization we looked at, Rising Up Angry. Rising Up Angry started organizing white working class greaser youth. So think about John Travolta's character in Grease, Jimmy. Only imagine a red star and a free Huey button, and you get who their initial base was, even though they moved on and did very, very innovative feminist organizing as they grew as an organization. They knew that their job was to organize white working class youth and meet them where they were at through respect for working class culture, the baseball games, the barbecues, everything that, and then taking people in a completely different direction towards solidarity. One great example of their work was when one greaser youth came into the Rising Up Angry office and tore off his free Huey button and said, "Do you have any guns? I need to go beat up the blacks," basically. What had happened was that a black man was accused of sexually harassing a white woman. It turned out not to be true, as oftentimes that happens. That's a script that has not been flipped in society even till today. And Rising Up Angry knew that there would be a gang war between white youth and black youth. Their slogan on their newspapers were fight the real enemy. And so they went out, and because of the base that they had built, the relationships they had built with white youth and the leaderships in the gangs, it was the gang war that never happened. They took responsibility for reaching out to the white community, and it never happened. This And they left to their black allies and the Black Panther Party and other community groups the responsibility for reaching out to the blacks. And it worked. So when we think about history from below, when we think about the stories and the values that are in ethnic studies stories, the banned books, we ask ourselves, what is deemed worthy of remembering? If it blows up, all respect to the Weather Underground and people who bravely put their bodies on the line in a different direction. If it blows up, you get 27 books and 3 documentaries about it, right? If you quietly make sure that a gang war that could have been one of the worst moments in Chicago's history never happens, it really takes moving mountains and some really difficult and challenging grassroots scholarship to make sure that comes back up into the historical memory. And with all of your experiences, with all the generations here, there are at least 50 more stories out there around what multiracial organizing looks like, the sanctuary movement, ACT UP, all of the things that we hold in our hearts as being prefigurative of a much better world. And I really encourage all of you, if I could leave you with one lesson, one plea, is to not discount the how important it is to bring in people's history to the organizing. Oftentimes we see it as a luxury, right? Something that we're going to do when we retire. No, it actually has to be part of the organizing process itself.